All the manifestations of the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century that we looked at in the last lecture, at least in terms of Britain, continued throughout the 19th, but in fact with much more force. The movement towards an industrial society was cumulative, with England becoming almost completely industrialized by the 1860s and 1870s. And in fact, England became the largest producer of goods in the world, carried around the British Empire into markets abroad in British ships, which returned to the mother country full of raw materials to make even more goods. Well, the factory system and the uncontrolled growth of cities increased production. 19th century institutions, however, weren't designed to support this change. There were fundamental changes that needed to be addressed, and as in any society, there was always a drag from those structures and institutions that had been developed at different times and that needed a certain amount of impetus to actually address the issue of how they were to respond to a more complex and different moment. The demographic shifts, not only in England, but in all of Europe, resulted in the movement of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of people from rural communities to the enormous industrial cities of the continent. And as countries industrialized, Belgium in the 1830s, France in the 1850s, Eastern Europe in the 1880s and 90s, Europe became a continent of cities. And these cities began developing an urban culture that we'll see beginning to challenge the traditions and values of traditional society. That is, those that were heavily dependent on rural practices and landed elites. Moreover, overall population in Europe had been rising steadily since the 16th century, and there was an enormous increase in population after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The result then, there was a much larger labor pool, so wages didn't always rise. As the number of workers were available, they were willing to work for less. And so consequently, the increase in population didn't necessarily mean that the new industrial wealth was equally distributed. In fact, sometimes wages declined as pockets of overpopulation allowed for competition for work to encourage some to take wages at less than even subsistence. Beyond this, industrialization changed the culture of the continent. And we have to investigate this from several perspectives over the coming lectures. For example, the factory system transformed the working environment. Now, not for the first time, but now on a universal level, the clock regulated the workforce, and it robbed the workers of their former independence. When we think of the traditions of rural society and agricultural labor, we think that the time is determined by the canonical hours being sounded by the church bell, of the repetitive demands of agricultural society, and the changing of the seasons. And there were other forces as well at work. In terms of personal and family dislocation, there were in fact remarkable moments that forced individuals and their families to adjust to a new world. They left their homes because they had to move to where the work was, as opposed to working at home surrounded by their families and the supportive structures of village life. Cottage industries, which had been so important to provide a small measure of independent income to farm labor, things like handloom weaving and the occupation of women within the household in order to ensure that there would be a small additional amount of income for the family to purchase luxuries, to purchase some protein that would add to the family diet, or simply to provide that margin of protection against disease or famine. These things all began to decline with the loss of domestic labor and the movement of the family from the farm to the industrial city. The new environment which these recently dislocated rural immigrants found themselves in was in fact not an attractive reproduction of the environment in which they had left. They found themselves in the industrial slum. Previously, large towns in Britain, for example, had been either administrative or episcopal centers. But after about 1800, the city was a production center for manufactured goods. There had always been an element of the city or the town being a place of buying and selling. They were market towns, but this is different. The industrial city became a city of factories to produce goods on a vast scale, to employ tens or hundreds of thousands of workers in order to produce goods to be sold, and not locally, but anywhere a market could exist. In the mid-18th century, small towns like Manchester, Birmingham, Sheffield, or Leeds became huge industrial metropolises. And because they were still, in the eyes of traditional society and the legal establishment, villages or towns, they lacked representation in Parliament. They lacked local services because they didn't have a municipal charter to allow them to establish those functions that would permit cities to grow and develop. There was no provision of clean water. There was no disposal of sewage. There was no protection on the streets at night. London received its first paid professional police force only in 1829. The roads were unpaved and the streets were just muddy sewers inhabited by hundreds of pigs or rats that ate the garbage. London, the great metropolis of England, was always a large city, always one of the largest cities in Europe. But it increased in size from 2.8 million people in 1850 to 4.5 million by 1901. Making it the largest city in the world. Moreover, population moved from the agricultural south to the industrial north, to the Midlands, the sites of those dark satanic mills. And the movement of people was facilitated by industrialization itself, again, both cause and effect. Railways were initially built to move goods, especially heavy goods, long distances. But before long, they were also carrying huge numbers of people. By 1842, there were about 1,850 miles of track and about 18 million passengers traveling by rail. But just 8 years later, by 1850, there were 6,620 miles of track laid and 72 million passengers. The result was that profits for the railway companies had quadrupled from 1842 to 1850. And it's not an accident then that the railway fortune becomes a recurring theme in 19th century novels. The idea, in fact, that investment and speculation in railway stocks was a way to get rich. But of course, as we also now know, it was a way to also lose your investment relatively easily. The spread of industrialization across the continent mirrored the patterns first seen in Britain. For example, new population centers arose in areas where raw materials and rivers existed, because factories tended to be constructed close to raw materials, transportation, and power, not where there were concentrations of labor. People move much more easily than heavy goods, and the transportation networks of the raw materials were much more important than access to labor. In France, for example, the Seine and Rhone valleys, the province of Lorraine. In Germany, the Ruhr and Saar, in the provinces of Saxony and Silesia. In the Habsburg lands, the Kingdom of Bohemia, rich in mines and rich in the tradition of skilled artisans. In Italy, the Veneto and Lombardy, which attracted hundreds of thousands of poor farmers moving from the agricultural south in order to operate the factories in Turin and Milan. Well, regardless where, everywhere, across the entire continent, there was over-rapid urbanization. And that meant that government services everywhere could not keep pace. The worst problem, and the one that was most visible to the most people, especially in the early decades of the Industrial Revolution, was the industrial slum, the problem of housing. The cities had grown so rapidly that there could be no easy provision for workers' houses, and they couldn't keep up with the immigration, and so the overcrowded industrial slum was born, with perhaps 5 or 6 families, large families, inhabiting a dwelling that originally was constructed for one. Because of this overcrowding and because of the lack of services, especially the lack of clean water and the lack of sewage disposal, the mortality rates were extraordinarily high. In every industrial city in Europe, the annual death rate exceeded the birth rate. The cities only grew at that exponential rate because of immigration. Also, there were no regulations. There were no restrictions on who could do what where. Not only were local services not provided by local government, but national standards of protection, the regulation of industry, social services of any kind were altogether absent. Because this was a new society. In the countryside, there were other agencies. There was the extended family, there was the church, there was the village community that could care to some extent for these sorts of elements. But in the city, none of these existed, and there was no agency yet equipped to move in and take responsibility for the well-being of the citizens. Add to this extremely low wages and laissez-faire economics that were used to justify this abuse. It is difficult for us to imagine, but there was almost no interest among most factory owners to help their workers. And these aren't men of Dickensian cruelty who simply enjoyed seeing the misery in which their workers lived. They were those who were convinced, who truly believed the economic and social doctrines of the day, and they actually believed that they were doing good. David Ricardo, in 1817, was an English, actually of Portuguese origin, hence the name, but an English economist who wrote in support of Adam Smith's economic liberalism. He was the author of an extraordinarily influential text, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, that was printed in 1817. This book, like The Wealth of Nations of Adam Smith of 1776, was required reading and a fundamental text for any of those who argued against any degree of government intervention into the lives of the poor. Ricardo argued that wealth was the product of land, capital, and labor. And in the marketplace, the value of a product comes from the amount of labor required to produce it. Ricardo called this his theory of labor value. This became critical because it proved to those who wanted to believe it and whose best interest it was to believe it, that the value of something is not based on the individual whim of the seller, but on economic laws that govern its price in the marketplace. Well, we've seen with Adam Smith that individual who encoded and enshrined the Enlightenment concepts of economics. There was a general belief that the laws of the economy operated in the same manner as the Newtonian laws of the universe. They were absolute, they were immutable, and not subject to regulation. But Ricardo continued, and he argued that wages were also subject to the marketplace, not just the price of goods, but the price of labor. His celebrated doctrine of the iron law of wages stated that if there was surplus labor, wages would fall. But if labor was in short supply, wages would increase. It was simply a question of supply and demand once more. But what are the implications of this? What does the iron law of wages really mean in terms of the factory owners and the workers who labored within these factories? Well, it was appropriate for wages to be sufficient for workers to, quote, subsist and perpetuate their race without either increase or diminution. In other words, wages should be kept at a level sufficient to keep the workers alive, but not to improve their diets or increase their fertility rate, because an increase in the population would depress wages and create unemployment, circumstances that were worse than subsistence salaries. So, Ricardo and his disciples saw a strong inverse relationship between the marketplace and government regulation. They believed that any intervention in the form of minimum wages, for example, or even labor legislation would upset the natural balance, the laws of the economy, that is, Adam Smith's unseen hand that must be seen to operate like the Newtonian laws of motion. And similarly, they believed that labor unions had to be kept illegal, or otherwise labor would exercise a monopolistic force and again undermine the natural operation of the economy, in which wages would be determined by those elements so clearly defined by David Ricardo and Adam Smith. So if you allowed the workers to organize, they would then enjoy a monopoly over labor, which would then change the natural movement of supply and demand and artificially increase the price of goods through the increased cost of wage, and so consequently the whole system would begin to erode. Well, factory owners, of course, accepted, indeed they embraced Ricardo's justification for keeping wages low. They argued, and they probably believed, that higher wages would reduce their competitiveness and consequently bring about more, not less, misery to the working classes, because their lack of competitiveness would mean that their businesses would fail, and those who were working would have no work, as opposed to at least being poorly paid, but having work. Well, we have to add to this. And it's not just the laws of the economy that operate, but also there was a moral perspective. And there was a subsequent element that it really was nothing short of a moral perspective in the economic arguments of laissez-faire capitalism. It was often believed that the poor, if given higher wages, not just would reproduce their numbers exponentially and consequently drive down the value of labor by having surplus labor available, but also they would engage in other kinds of activities that would destroy the family and in fact endanger themselves as individuals and as a class. Because if given higher wages, the poor would drink them away. And because they lacked moral restraint, they would produce ever more offspring. These attitudes result in Ricardo and those laissez-faire economists of the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century as being vilified. But we have to look at him in context. David Ricardo was not a cold-hearted individual. He wasn't Mr. Gradgrind. He wasn't that caricature of the 19th century mill owner or manager. He wasn't Ebenezer Scrooge. He wasn't callous or cruel. But he, like so many of the industrial leaders in Europe, simply believed they were operating according to those almost Newtonian laws of nature that governed the economy, the unseen hand. Ricardo and Smith argued for the natural balance of the marketplace, and they declared that any form of government intervention was a return to the old mercantilist methods of monopoly and centralized regulation. Well, besides theory, there was popular fear of this new industrial working class. It was one thing to talk about them in the abstract. It's one thing to discuss the role of wages and the role of labor, to talk about the growth of a factory system. It's something else to actually see them in operation and see their numbers and see the changes taking place as a consequence of these fundamental economic changes. A class that had never existed before in Europe was the industrial working class. The numbers and the concentration of these workers in cities threatened the owners of property and their settled comfort. They were afraid of their own workers. And two events in 1819 crystallized this fear. Two events seemed to illustrate the fear that the property-owning classes had of this new group. These people who had come from far away to inhabit their cities under conditions that they could not even imagine. This represented a hardening of what we now call class lines, and it presaged the division that would emerge between those with property and those without. That division that would characterize a good deal of 19th century politics and ultimately reach its conclusions in some of the revolutions of that century and the last. But 1819 becomes an important year in this dramatic story. In 1819, 50,000 workers, the unemployed and their families, gathered in St. Peter's Field in Manchester to call for reform. They were calling for reform to deal with the social and economic problems that we have been discussing. Because after all, Manchester represented the problem that the industrial slum illustrated. Manchester was a village. The building of factories in the town didn't change that. It had no municipal charter. In fact, it didn't receive its municipal charter until the 1830s. It had no representation in Parliament. It had no legal basis in which to offer the most basic civil services. There could be no water supply. There could be no paving of streets. There could be no police because Manchester as a town or city was not incorporated. The gathering of 50,000 people, an enormous number of people at any time, in a public field caused the magistrates, who of course came from the landed elite, they were still those continuators of the justices of the peace and those who had traditional authority because of their ownership of property, caused them to panic, and they read the Riot Act. The Riot Act called for this group to disperse in 1 hour. They didn't. They stayed where they were. And because there was an atmosphere of panic, the militia was called out. The Manchester militia was composed of about 1,500 officers and men from the 15th Hussars. From the beginning, the class differences became apparent. The aristocratic officers who looked upon these 50,000 workers dressed in rags and in desperate condition as something that was barely human, a group of people that they are just not used to dealing with at all. They were reminded, because of the close connection they shared with the Iron Duke, of the Duke of Wellington's statement to his officers as he rode through his own camp on the eve of the Battle of Waterloo. He said, "I don't know if these men frighten the French, but by God, they terrify me." This is a division in class and a difference in attitude. So the aristocratic officers ordered their cavalry to attack the unarmed protesters. The dragoons fell upon the crowd, slashing with their sabers. 11 men, women, and children were killed, and another 400 seriously injured, many very badly indeed. Because the last time that the 15th Hussars had charged in battle was at the Battle of Waterloo, this massacre in the fields of Manchester was known as the Peterloo Massacre, and it entered the collective unconscious and the memory of the industrial working class as a terrible moment, and also again began to harden the lines and the fear on both parts, the fear of the workers of those who own property and the fear of those who own property of the workers. The second event was almost a comic opera act of conspiracy, but one again that terrified a nation. And it also indicated that some of those that were sympathetic to change in order to support and to benefit the industrial working class threatened not just civil order, but perhaps the integrity of the state itself. This was the 1819 Cato Street conspiracy. The plot was hatched by those who believed that direct action was necessary to change the policies of the English government, to address the needs of the industrial poor. The leaders of the plot had in fact read some of the most radical works produced during the French Revolution and just after, works that called for, in effect, class revolution in order to redistribute not just power but also property. And they thought perhaps the place to begin was in fact in England in order to ensure that this revolution would happen there first, where industrialism first in fact occurred. The result was, of course, to greatly exacerbate the fear and the contempt of the working classes felt by the English elite. But the plot was, in so many ways, absurd. The plot was to kill the Prime Minister and the entire cabinet while they met for a dinner at a house in Cato Street in London. But like so many of these conspiracies, it was betrayed by a spy. The conspirators were captured, and in May of 1820, they were executed. The implication of this, not that this comic opera plot happened at all, but that it happened in a way that seemed to be another example that those who were agitating for the improvement of the conditions of the industrial working class would go to great lengths, any lengths, including assassination and murder, in order to achieve those ends. So rather than create sympathy, as the conspirators had hoped, the Peterloo Massacre and the Cato Street conspiracy hardened attitudes. The belief that would characterize all of Europe for much of the 19th century then became evident in Britain by the early years of that century. Classe laborieuse, classe dangereuse, as the French said. That is, working people are by definition dangerous people. And this is something we will see regularly during the 19th century. An attitude that because the poor have no property, they have nothing to lose. Because the poor have no property, they will happily take the property of others and use it for their benefit. That they have no stake in society, that they're shiftless, and so consequently they have to be controlled, and that's why they are dangerous by definition. As a consequence of these events, rather than address the economic circumstances of the poor, the position of the established elite was to extend repression and measures of control. At the very best, those who had the greatest sympathy offered some form of moral reclamation or charity. We will save your souls even though we will allow your body to die of infectious disease or starvation. We will provide some measure of paternalistic charity because we feel badly for you living under these terrible circumstances. But after 1819, the actions on the part of frustrated workers who felt powerless, who had no voice to address the injustices of their lives, fell to the practice of direct action, which reinforced the elite in the fear of them as a class. The danger then became evident and would arise later as one of the motivations for elements of parliamentary and social change. Because there was no instrument by which dissent could be voiced by the poor, they didn't have the vote. They had no means of organization. Labor unions were still illegal. They had no way to indicate their misery except by direct and violent action. Then, in fact, it would be necessary to deal with these symptoms rather than actually address the cause. These unemployed weavers, spinners, and carders, those who had been left without work because of the end of domestic textile production, became not just workers in the factory, but those who either did not find work in the factories or those who felt the factories totally incongenial and unable to stay there, became Luddites. Luddites were named after the fictitious Ned Ludd. And what they did was destroyed machinery and they burned factories. They believed that by destroying the machines, by destroying the mills, that their jobs may return. That having no factories, having destroyed machines, would require the manufacturer to return once more to the domestic handicraft industry. Of course, it didn't happen. On the continent, there were Luddites as well, but they were known more by their action rather than their mythical leader. On the continent, they committed acts of sabotage, and the name indicates the nature of their direct action. The sabots are the wooden shoes worn by French peasants. And as the French peasants were drawn into the factories and into the towns, hating their work, oppressed by their overseers, they dropped their wooden shoes into the machinery, creating acts of sabotage. That is, the destruction of machinery by the intervention of the wooden shoe, and symbolically, the symbol of the peasant, getting back at the factory owner by using the symbolism of the difference in class and social position. The sabotage, though, of the continent was no more effective than the mythical exploits of Ned Ludd. There was no way to address these difficulties and problems on the basis of direct action or even the kinds of social organization and violence and anger that began to percolate through parts of European society broadly as a consequence of the effects of industrialization. Fortunately, despite the Luddism on the part of the workers and the fear on the part of the propertied classes, there were those who saw the need for some form of legislation to protect at least the most vulnerable of the industrial working class. And of course, they identified the children first. The factory system required work from all ages, with children playing an extremely important role. Children were necessary because in the mines they could get into very, very small shafts. In the factories, they were small enough to run underneath the machinery, carrying equipment back and forth and often suffering terrible accidents as a consequence. So the first Factory Acts, introduced in England in 1833, essentially regulated the labor of children. Children under 9, for example, couldn't work in factories at all, and children between 9 and 13 could only work for 8 hours a day. Those between 13 and 18 could work 12 hours, and children under 10 were not permitted to work in the mines, and they added women could only work at the mine head and not in the pits. The working conditions of men were not addressed at all. But addressing child labor didn't in any way address the cause of child labor. The fact that families would continually have more and more children because the more children they had, the more wages they brought in. So the cause of child labor wasn't in fact in any way addressed, just the regulation of the fact that children were in the factories. And the quality of life in the early industrial slum was in fact in no way improved. In fact, it's been argued that it actually became worse because less money was brought into the family unit because young children were not permitted to work. There was little or no clean water, no sewage removal. There were regular pandemics. Family violence, drunkenness, incest, prostitution were everywhere in the slums. But these social problems were identified by the elites as moral failings on the part of the poor rather than the effects of their living conditions. Consequently, a moral as well as an economic and social divide began to separate the industrial working classes from those who made policy. And the churches alienated the poor by giving sermons on vice and trying not to ameliorate their conditions, but for blaming them for their own misery. Fearing a revolution, many English reformers and members of the middle class saw the only way to deal with these issues was to look at their root cause, to address them through legislation. These became the founders of liberal parties across the continent. For their part, the working classes in Europe felt totally abandoned by the elites, and they sought their own champions, and they sought their own economic and social theorists who were committed to improving their lot. They were the ones who then embraced socialism. Both the ideologies of socialism and liberalism then were the product of European capitalism, which will be the subject of our next lecture.